I'm very happy to welcome you to the next edition of CAFFE seminar. We have two very exciting papers on the program, and the first one will be presented by Giovanna Nicodano, Dano from Torino and CEPR, and the title of the talk is Hedging Permanent Income Shocks. I suggest that we only have clarifying questions during the talk, and then there'll be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Also, if you turn on your cameras, it will give all of us a chance to realize that COVID is over and it's safe to have our cameras on now. So with that, over to you, Giovanna.
Thank you. So let me share slides. Thank you very much for inviting me to present this paper, which is joint work with Fabio Bagliano, Raffaele Corvino, and Carolina Fugazza, who are also at the University of Torino and Collegio Carlo Alberto. And what led us to study this topic is the disconnect between portfolio theory and the evidence concerning stock market participation. And portfolio theory suggests that if stock returns amplify permanent income shocks due to positive correlation between the two, then investors should reduce stock holdings relative to the case of zero correlation, and may also have to avoid stock holdings altogether. And this fact that hedging demands could be negative might explain stock market non-participation, which is observed empirically. However, it turns out that empirically the sensitivity of equity market participation to estimates of correlation is small when it is statistically different from zero. And also the correlation estimates, the mean correlation estimates are often close to zero, implying negligible hedging demand for stocks. And so observed non-participation is called the participation puzzle since at least 20 years. And what we do in this paper is to connect the observed non-participation to hedging motives. And how we proceed? We proceed by slightly modifying the model by Carroll and Samwick, which is a pioneering model of earning shocks. And we simply allow in this parsimonious parametric model that the permanent income shocks of each individual co-moves with an aggregate shock in proportion to his or her own correlation coefficient. And given this parametric model, we derived the covariance restrictions, not only the intertemporal ones, but importantly, the cross-sectional ones. So if Raman and my income move together with an aggregate shock, then our co-movements will allow us to estimate our correlation coefficient, at least if the observed co-movements are large enough. And once we have these cross-sectional and intertemporal covariances, we use minimum distance estimation to estimate the parameter of interest. But we also impose clustering for reasons that I will explain. By clustering, I mean imposing equal correlation coefficients for agents with similar time-invariant characteristics. What's the difference between this method and prior methods? With prior methods, exploit the time series dimension of the data, which is typically small in this household data set, whereas it's the longitudinal dimension, which is large. And what they do, they proxy permanent income shocks with averages of earnings growth, and then they regress them onto stock returns. Whereas what we do, we exploit the information embedded in the covariance abstraction of earnings, thereby exploiting the very large cross-sectional dimension of the data together with the time series dimension. And after estimating these individual correlation coefficients, we ran a race with prior methods, with 3 prior methods. And we first studied the sensitivity of participation, of equity market participation and of the equity portfolio share to the different correlation estimates. And we use the specification proposed by Bonaparte, Corniotis, and Kumara, which I will call BKK and from now on. And we also use their Dutch data. Now, since we get very interesting results, we start checking whether they hold when we do not cluster and on shorter samples. We also ran an out-of-sample probit of participation given the good results, and then we check whether changing the clustering, shifting to US PSID data, changes the results. Furthermore, to address the possibility of unobserved heterogeneity driving the cross-sectional results, we use the parametric model and the Kalman filter to estimate changes over time in individual correlations. And we examine the revision in individual participation over time in response to changes in correlation estimates. And finally, since our model and our estimates refer to an aggregate latent shock, whereas previous literature studies stock correlation with stock market returns, we repeat all the analysis using stock market returns. And we think that we connect non-participation to hedging motives, and this is relevant not only for positive reasons for support to the theory, but also for normative reasons, because measuring the correlation allows to avoid over or under investment in stocks. But in more detail, like the results are that the hedging demand for the mean investor is negative in both Dutch and US data over different subperiods. And the clustering corrects a bias, a downward bias in measuring these correlations, which was conjectured by Giovanna. And importantly, there are the large sensitivity of both participation and asset allocation to these estimates of correlation in all the experiments. And the results do not substantially change when we use stock returns instead of the latent aggregate shock. Let me skip the very large literature I should mention, just saying that hedging motives matter when we look at the variance of permanent income shocks. So this disconnect between like correlation and variance is further puzzle. In our view, there should have been something going on also with correlation. What about income shock co-movements, the parametric model? This is the parametric model of Carroll and Samwick, where log labor income is a function of observable characteristics, of a vector of observable characteristics and of labor income shocks that are driven by a transitory shock and a random walk, and U, the permanent income shock, has both an aggregate and an idiosyncratic part. Now, in the original formulation, the aggregate part is not individual specific, doesn't have the subscript I, whereas we assume that U is driven by two orthogonal standard normal latent variables W, and WT is the latent aggregate shock, And so the permanent income shock co-varies for individual I, co-varies with the aggregate shock in proportion to the correlation coefficient I. And the parametrization is such that rho I splits the variance of the income shocks into the aggregate component and the idiosyncratic component. And of course, when rho I is fixed for all i's, we get back the standard model where everybody is exposed in the same way to the aggregate shock. Now, what do we do with this parametric model? As I mentioned, we squeeze out both a large amount of cross-sectional conditions on labor income growth and a large amount of intertemporal covariances. We also exploit sub-intervals of length D to increase the number of conditions. And let me focus just on this covariance between cross-sectional covariance of income shocks. I mentioned the correlation between Raman's and my income, which delivers two parameters to estimates, but just one co-movement. But if I add into the picture Kim's labor income, I have three co-movements and three conditions to estimate three parameters. So from then on, the system is over-identified. So with this huge number of conditions and minimum distance estimation, we estimate the n parameters, correlation coefficient, the variance of permanent shocks, and the variance of transitory shocks. And Monte Carlo simulations confirm accuracy of the estimation method. When we take it to the real data, we use first the Dutch household survey, 93-2019, and the reason is not only that Bonaparte, Korniotis, and Kumar used them, but also that they have panel data with personal characteristics, with a lot of personal characteristics, including risk aversion and financial literacy for over 1,800 people. And I will focus on, in this presentation, on this measure of participation, which is whether individuals own stocks both directly and indirectly, or sorry, whether they own stock directly or through mutual funds or both. And so this is the mean share of participants, which is 0.32. Of course, we have also the portfolio shares invested in stocks and a lot of other characteristics. As I said, we group individuals according to 5 stable characteristics: gender, education, urbanization, financial literacy, and risk aversion, thus achieving 80 clusters that just differ in one characteristic, and we impose the same correlation within a group. And so just to give you an idea of the number of conditions and parameters, if we didn't cluster, we would have to estimate 1886 parameters with over 1.5 million moment conditions. But we just have to estimate 82 parameters after clustering. And not only efficiency, not only this over-identification allows to gain in efficiency, but the clustering also should correct an underestimation of systematic risk according to a conjecture by Coen and others. So this is, let me focus on this. It just visually tells you this, that our estimates, this is the distribution of minimum distance correlation estimates, shift to the right relative to both the sample correlation and the Bonaparte-Korniotis-Kumar correlation. But the same is true relative to the three benchmark methods that we have, so not only BKK, but also Coen et al., and also the Coco-Gomez-Menout original estimates. And this is our cluster estimates with a mean coefficient of 0.25. And you will see that whichever the sample, the data, etc., the mean correlation is always above 0.25. It drops to 0.19 when we measure with stock market returns. And given the shift to the right in the distribution of correlations, 79% of non-participants in our sample have negative hedging demand. And this compares with lower numbers according to previous methods. And let me just stress at this point that the BKK method doesn't use clustering, whereas the Coen and the Coco-Gomez and others do use clustering, but all of them use essentially the time series dimension of the data. Now, if I had to summarize the paper with a picture, I would pick this picture where you see that if I sort according to correlation into quintiles on the horizontal axis and I put the participation rate on the vertical axis, I see a downward sloping pattern, whereas if I do the same with estimates derived with previous method, I don't get the same pattern. Of course, something similar for the risky share, but let me go back since time is... So how do we validate these estimates? We use the same specification as in Bonaparte et al., where the dependent variable is the one that I described before, and the regressors are the personal characteristics and the standard deviation of income growth volatility, and the different metrics of correlation. So this is our correlation estimates, which is a fairly stable coefficient. Now, let me stress that we don't use the same sample period as Bonaparte and others. We have also estimates in the paper and where we replicate exactly the results. In this particular sample, they are not statistically significant, but they are in other samples. In the case of Coen, the correlation coefficient is the beta is statistically significant when alone, but when we add our MD correlation, it's much more powerful, and the same occurs for the beta estimated by Coco-Gomez and Menout. Similar pattern for a Tobit estimates for the proportion invested in stocks, both like in both directly, indirectly, and etc. We have a similar pattern where the three measures matter together with our estimates, they tend to lose statistical significance, although in this case, the permanent shock of Bonaparte retains statistical significance. As I said, in order to compare exactly with the results with those in Bonaparte, we also shrink our estimates to a shorter time period. We estimate correlations and validation with data up to 2011 only. And since results continue to hold, we attempt an out-of-sample estimate, which is not normally performed in the literature. And so this is the correlation estimate performed on computed with data up until 2011. The dummy is equal to 1 for those reporting to own stock over 2012-2019, so out of sample. And for the people who were not in the sample until 2011, we attribute to them the correlation coefficient based on their characteristics in 2012. And as you can see, also in this out-of-sample experiment, the results hold. Now, we shift to PSID, always over 2011, and as you can see, the results tend to be consistent with those obtained before. So it's the clustering that boosts the permanent income shock, aggregate shock correlation. And there is a shift to the right, although in this case, the Guvenen beta is close to our estimates. And why we do this? We do this because we have different clustering variables like industry and education as in previous literature. And in this case, Guvenen, 98% of non-participants have negative hedging demand according to the estimates in Guvenen. And also in general, non-participation is more easily associated with negative hedging demands. But once we look at sensitivity, we obtain that like the Bonaparte, Korniotis, Kumar have statistical significance, the beta Guvenen no longer has a statistical significance, and so also the Coco-Gomez-Manhunt. Now, I'm not sure whether I have time to cover the Kalman filter.
So 3 minutes.
3 minutes. So what we do is we use the parametric model to measure the permanent income shocks over time for each individual based on the realization of the stock market return and the realization of income. And then once we do this, we compute the correlations over time. And this is an example of positive correlation of an agent with negative correlation. And we repeat with this. So we study whether this correlation coefficient can explain participation over time. And so just one more picture is here. As you can see, we can place the revised Kalman filter correlation, and the results still hold. So what do we get when we study stock market returns as opposed to aggregate shock? We get a similar mean positive correlation coefficient, and we get the same results when we take to the participations. We study participation sensitivity and asset allocation sensitivity. The coefficients are slightly larger to compensate for the smaller estimates of correlation. Now, I don't have the button to go back. Why I don't have the button to go back? Let me see if I go back now. Yeah. So we run several robustness. I'm not going to steal time to the presentation of Jami. Perhaps, no. I'm just going to conclude and say that we think we connect robustly the non-participation to hedging motives. And whereas with previous methods, the non-participation puzzle is confirmed because either mean hedging demand is negligible or the sensitivity to participation to correlation is negligible, or both. And why we get these results? We believe that they owe both to the clustering, and but especially to the this look at in focus on individual earnings co-movements with aggregate shock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giovanna. So we can open it up to questions now. If you have questions, you can just ask directly, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. So, Giovanna, maybe I'll ask one question. Like, suppose there was no correlation at all between labor income and portfolio returns. Then, even then, labor income volatility would have an effect on my demand for equities because of the risk. So if you like, you can call it background risk from labor income, or it's a undiversifiable risk. So my demand for equities should go down, even in the absence of correlations, right?
Yeah, but that was even in previous literature, especially in the two papers by Fager and Guizo, and a recent paper that came out in JFE in 2024, they establish the link, but also in prior literature with less tight identification method, this relationship between volatility and portfolio choice was there. So the one that was elusive was the one through correlation. And this is why we focus on correlation. But it is interesting, though, that while in papers that don't manage to estimate so precisely correlation, and don't use the identification method of the two most recent papers, even the volatility has a shaky relationship with observed portfolio choice. When you do control for correlation with our method, volatility seems to consistently explain portfolio choice. So it's, yeah, I didn't stress this in the presentation, but that's borne out by the estimates.
Very nice.
I also have a question. So you, in a way, it's about like co-movements, right, within the stock market and earnings. But the way I always think about it, it's really about the, let's say, tails happening at the same time. So bad tails happening at the same time. Is that something, and this comes a bit from ignorance.
The tails? Sorry.
The tails, so the extremes. So I feel like when I think about like what really keeps people out of the stock market would be like very bad events happening simultaneously in the labor market and the stock market. Is that something that your model can say something about? Whether it's aggregate move, like really slow movements together, or
we do
tails?
not have, so Raffaele is here as well. No, we don't have non-normalities. So we don't look at co-skewness, co-kurtosis, and the like. So it's really the typical portfolio choice model, the traditional one. Let me say, though, that we experimented a little bit in another paper with non-normalities just in income, so not the ones you were referring to. And the non-normalities in income didn't seem sufficient. And also, I think that's also in the literature to track non-participation that well. They can explain why the optimal portfolio share goes down, but non-participation is really not.
Also not the tails being correlated, like bad events in one and bad events in the other.
It would reinforce the result regarding non-participation, but our paper is silent about those extreme events. It is really the even recessions. Think of normal recession. So without getting into crisis events, normal recessions, you would have that your income goes down because your bonus goes down, and at the same time, or your firm doesn't sell enough, and at the same time, your portfolio return goes down as well. And for that reason, you tend to reduce your optimal portfolio holding.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, I mean, yes, I have a very simple question. Is why? So, can you just remind us why you're getting results that are different from what previous literature had found? Because the results are confirming theory in a very strong way. So, can you just remind us, how you're getting to these strong results?
We believe there are two components of this strong result. One is that we exploit a large number of conditions to estimate just a few parameters, whereas in previous literature, by regressing the proxy for the income shocks onto stock returns just on the time series, the precision of the estimate was low. And this is one type of, so it's not only precision, but it is also a wealth of information embedded in the co-movements that was not exploited. And the second reason that is important is Coen has this idea that if you do not cluster agents properly, you're going to overestimate idiosyncratic risk, because you cannot really pin down the systematic risk that is common to subsets of the population. And so the clustering is the second thing that blows up the estimates of correlations. But the fact that the estimates are so robust in subsamples and across different data sets, I think owes to the number of conditions relative to the number of parameters. Raffaele is here, so can correct me, but...
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I have a small question about the cluster. So you, in a way, you want within cluster people to be sort of more homogeneous, and I think urbanization was one of the clusters, and the way that in the Netherlands, so a country that I know quite well, there's less homogeneity, I think, within people. It's not that, let's say, living in an urban area or a non-urban area truly divides people that much, because it's a very densely populated country in general. And so I'm not sure that for the Netherlands, urbanization is the best cluster. Did you play around with different clusters?
So we checked that there was also in OLS regressions some meaning of the cluster, and there was some meaningful response. We could experiment. I think now we have added we have also experimented with cohorts, I think, in a different version. But the results seem to be fairly consistent. Also, if you think of PSID, it's totally different clustering variables, and yet the results come out roughly the same. But we will think about it. Oh, please, Raffaele would like to, please.
I mean, a slightly different version of clustering. Now we are also using only education, cohort, and gender. They're completely very time invariant. There should be. So we get less clusters. So I mean, there should be around 50 clusters. But still, I mean, the results are pretty similar to the ones that we get in this current version. So I mean, that's a good point about clustering, but we have played a bit about that. And also, Giovanna was mentioning about PSID. So in PSID, we cluster based in a very consistent way with Campbell and Becerra. We cluster based on industries and education, and the results are similar. So yeah, I mean, shouldn't be. I mean, the clustering variable shouldn't be, let's say, driving the results.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. So let's move on to the second paper now, which will be presented by Jamie Coen. Thank you, Giovanna.
Thanks to you.
Okay, hopefully you can all see this. So thanks very much to the organisers for having me along to present. So I'm going to present joint work with Neil Kashyap and May Rostam. The Bank of England has the data, and it's also May's institution, so there's a disclaimer at the bottom. The paper's about price discrimination and mortgage choice. And we're in the setting of the UK mortgage market, where, like anywhere else, kind of the biggest financial choice that most people make is to take out a mortgage. And by virtue of the data we have and the setting of the UK, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later, we're in quite a nice position to study this decision, because we can see mortgages that people choose to take out and mortgages that people could have chosen to take out. It was available to them, but they chose not to. So by virtue of that, we're able to study how people make choices from menus of mortgages and how lenders set mortgage menus and how these two things interact, the choice and the mortgage menu. And in doing that, we're hoping to learn a little bit about the mortgage market and how mortgages work and how mortgage choice for customers work, and also a bit more generally how menus and choices take place in high-stakes situations for loans. And the paper is a sequence of facts and then a rationale for those facts. And the facts are in order on this screen, which are: most people face a daunting number of mortgages to choose from. I'll talk about exactly how we construct it, but what I'm talking about there is for very similar products, we're pasting together menus of different options that people had, both at the bank where they shopped and across banks. And basically, as one finds when one goes for all sorts of financial products, there's a lot of options, and they're all varying in minorly different ways. These ways have some price implications, but it's quite a difficult choice problem that one is faced with. And by virtue of UK mortgages, we're able to talk pretty convincingly, we think, about cheap mortgages and expensive mortgages. We're going to play around with definitions in order that we can rank mortgages from the cheapest to the most expensive. And again, I'll go into more detail on that later. And then we're able to talk about how well people chose from the set of mortgages that were available to them. Where picking well is picking the cheap option on the mortgage.
Jamie, the sound is not very good. Like, can you try making some change?
Yes, let me.
It's a bit choppy.
Let me think.
I don't know if you have headphones.
Let me. So, loud and clear like this is
This is
good,
better,
or
yeah.
do I need? Okay, that's good news. Good. So let me know if that problem crops up again. So where we are is that people don't pick particularly well in an ordinal sense. That is, if you rank mortgages from cheapest to most expensive, they pick somewhere in the middle. If they have 100 options, they're picking around 50th on average. But for most people, the menu is structured such that this doesn't cost them a lot of money. Whilst they don't pick the cheapest, the cost of different mortgages are quite closely clustered together, so they don't leave much money on the table. But there's a set of customers, 7%, according to a criterion that we define, that leave what we think is a meaningful amount of money on the table. These people make mortgage choices where they pick something, where if they picked something, a different option, they'd have got essentially the same product and would have come out with more money. Who are these people? They are people who are borrowing large amounts relative to the value of their house and relative to their income. And by virtue of the people who take out those kind of mortgages, they are young people and people taking out mortgages for the first time. And the key thing that drives these people being the ones who leave lots of money on the table is the menus they get. They get given menus where the stakes are higher, where there is more price dispersion on the menu. So I pick not that well, I don't get punished for it. Someone else, the younger people, the first-time buyers, they pick not that well, and that means that they leave a lot of money on the table. The question then is, what can explain this? And we initially explored various explanations like the cost of servicing different people, or maybe there's some issue around some people qualify for some mortgages and some people don't, or maybe there's some individual unobserved heterogeneity that can rationalize these choices. And I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways of cutting the data and a bunch of features of the UK institutional framework that we think rule those out. Emphatically, those things can't explain these findings, these set of 3 findings. What we think is the alternative that survives is price discrimination. That is, people are using price discrimination, using the menu to price discriminate across customers. The story we have in mind is, I, as a bank, want to attract people who are sophisticated, who shop well, to take out a mortgage from my bank. But I also want to profit from people's bad choices. That is, people who take out expensive products, I'd like to give them some expensive products so that I can profit from that choice. The law and the fact that I can't observe all individuals' private characteristics mean I can't perfectly price discriminate, say, you're smart, you get this mortgage, you're not smart, you get that mortgage. I have to offer these people the same menu. But when I believe that I'm dealing with groups that have more of the unsophisticated kind, more of the people who are either constrained from making better choices or unable to make better choices, I dial up this price dispersion. And that price dispersion is such that these people, these young people, these first-time buyers, leave money on the table. And I'm not going to talk at all about what is quite a rich literature. Our key contribution here, we think, is this price discrimination via the menu. So I'm going to talk briefly about the market structure, then how we rank mortgages and how we analyze mortgages, and then I'm going to try and convince you of those findings. So the UK is a mortgage market where most mortgages have a fixed rate period of 2, 3, or 5 years. You have a teaser rate for that period, and then you have another 20 years or so of a floating rate, where that floating rate is typically not an attractive rate, which means that people often refinance, roll over their mortgage multiple times, either at the end of the initial period or a little bit later. Mortgages have broadly 5 components: the length of this initial period, 2, 3, or 5, the size of the initial teaser rate, a number, 3%, 4%, 6%, a fee that's paid up front, that's a small number, it's like £500 or no pounds or £1,000. This reset rate, which is what your rate reset to after the initial period, after the 2, 3, or 5 years, and a maximum LTV that says you qualify for this mortgage if the ratio of the loan that you're taking out to the value of your house is no higher than 85%, 90%, whatever. Customers face multi-product menus at multiple banks. That is, at a given bank, for a given initial fixation period, let's say 2 years, you face lots of different combinations of max LTVs, initial rates, upfront fees, and reset rates, which means you get quite a lot of options on a menu, both at a given bank and across banks. Banks in our setting, I can't say who they are, but they are 6 very big banks in the UK that cover a very large part of our mortgage market here. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and characterize menus that people face for essentially the same product. And then we're going to talk about how well people choose on that menu. So to do that, for each person, I see in the data the mortgage that they took out. Based on that, its LTV, its rate, its fee, the reset rate they would reset to if they choose to hold it past the initial period, how long the initial period is. And based on that, I can work out what other mortgages they could have taken out but chose not to. So given the mortgage observed for person X, I can then see all the mortgages that were on offer that they could have chosen, but they chose not to. And we're only going to compare banks within the same initial period. So if you took out a 2-year fix, I'm going to compute the menu of options that also were 2-year fixed that you could have chosen to take out but did not. And crucially, I'll come back to this later on. We're going to do this both within the chosen bank. So if you took out a mortgage at a given bank, we're going to construct the menu of the alternatives you chose down at that bank. But then we're also going to paste on the menus that you could have chosen at different banks across all 6 banks. I'm going to show you results for across bank menus, but everything holds within bank. And I'll talk a bit later about what that guards against in terms of explanations. We're then going to compute the net present value of payments over the first 7 years of your mortgage. So on average, people broadly refinance sometimes, but they don't refinance immediately once the initial period expires. So they're holding it for an average 7 years. We're going to compute the NPV of the payments, i.e. the rate payments and paying back the mortgage over these first 7 years. We play around with that in the paper to show that our results don't depend on that, but that's what I'm going to show you in these slides. We're then going to rank mortgages from cheapest to most expensive. Cheapest, lowest NPV of repayments, most expensive, most expensive. And that's all, again, for the same product, the 2-year fixed rate mortgages. And then we're going to define a baseline mortgage, which is a good choice. Something which we think, if you pick that, you've done reasonably well. We're going to pick the 15th percentile of your choice set. So if you had 100 choices in your menu, this is the 15th cheapest. And we're going to say, we're going to measure your choices relative to that. So all choices, when I talk about good choices or bad choices, expensive choices or inexpensive choices, it's all relative to the choices you had available on your choice set. Once again, we can play around with that 15th percentile and we're not going to get very different results. Again, I'll briefly talk about other ways we've done this, but then I will show you results based on just that NPV-based ranking. One way we've also run all our results that I'll show you is assuming that instead of people refinancing after 7 years, they refinance as soon as the initial period expires. So if you're in a 2-rate fixed rate mortgage, we could instead compute the cost of mortgages, assuming that you refinance after 2 years. That we've done, and intuitively what it does is it says, forget about the reset rate, assume that no one pays this reset rate that you incur after the teaser rate expires. And once we do that, we get exactly the same results. So it's not about the reset rate driving these results or something arbitrary about our decision there. I also, in the paper, we have an alternative ranking of mortgages. I'm comparing mortgages just based on the NPV of the payments. I could also compare mortgages based on something called dominance, where I say a mortgage is better than another mortgage if it has a lower initial fee, a lower initial rate, and a lower reset rate. And if it doesn't satisfy all 3 of those criteria, it's not better. We have done all the same results according to this criterion, where literally it has to be better weekly on every dimension and strictly better on one dimension. And this rules out any idea that maybe you can rationalize expensive choices by people really liking fees or really liking reset rates and really caring about those things. And once again, bear in mind that everything looks the same when we run our rankings according to this. Let's return to our baseline, which is just ordering choices in the menu by NPV. What do choices and what do menus look like? This is across all 6 banks. The average person in our choice, which I should have said was from 2009 to 2015, they had a choice set of around 70 mortgages in their menu. And that's for 2-year fixed, or 3-year fixed, or 5-year fixed. Just looking at the same product, they have an enormous amount of choices from which to pick. On the right-hand side, I'm calculating, on average, how well do people pick. Median person is somewhere in the middle of the bunch. They pick around 50th percentile, around the median expensive choice in their menu. So it's not like they're finding the cheapest menu, they're finding the needle in the haystack. They pick okay. But does that mean they're picking badly or well? Well, it depends how much money they leave on the table. And what I'm plotting here on this CDF is I'm plotting how much percentage of their income customers leave on the table relative to that baseline choice of the 15th percentile. So if you're on the right-hand side, you've picked better than the 15th percentile. If you're to the left, you've picked worse than the 15th percentile, and you've left 2, 3, 4% of your monthly income on the table. Most people are in this gray area, neither lose nor gain a lot of money relative to our baseline choice. But there's this set of people out to the left-hand tail. They make bad choices, expensive choices. This is around £100 a month that they're leaving on the table. We think that's meaningful. We think if we went back to those people and said, look, you could get the same product for cheaper, they'd say, fair enough. That's something that would have been better. These are expensive choices. This is what the rest of the paper is going to study. Who are these people? Why did they make expensive choices? What can we learn from the fact that they made expensive choices?
Can I ask a question?
Yep, please.
Can you tell us again a little bit about how you define the expensive choice here? So, for example, a mortgage with a longer maturity might be more expensive in net present value terms, but that might better fit some kind of income profile. You're young, you don't want to repay now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you take those things into account, or is this net present value of the payments?
So the vast majority of our mortgages are going to be 25 years. And we're only comparing choices of the same initial fixation period. So I'm comparing your 2-year fix with a 25-year maturity to other 2-year fixes that you could have chosen at the same bank or at a different bank with the same maturity of the contract and also a 2-year fixation period. So there, the only kind of individual heterogeneity that could rationalize making more expensive choices according to our menu is maybe you really wanted to avoid paying a fee, or you were happy to pay a higher reset rate further down the line because you're short on money now. And so you really wanted a low initial rate in these first 2 years. So that could contaminate our results here. But there are 2 things to bear in mind, or 3 things. One, we shouldn't get too fixated on fees. They're small numbers, and a feature of the UK market is that you can either pay that fee up front, or you can add it onto the cost of the mortgage. And just add it onto the mortgage and pay it later over the duration of your mortgage. That means that there's no liquidity constraint that can rationalize people avoiding fees because they could just add it on. And secondly, the robustness check, which I've referred to, but I'm not showing you here, is when we compare mortgages purely on the criterion of domination. That is, something is only better than another mortgage if it is lower initial rate, lower fee, and lower reset rate. Even then, all our results hold. So in principle, that's something we really need to worry about. But the features of the UK mortgage market and the robustness checks that we run mean that we don't think that can possibly explain our results.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So these are these expensive choices. According to our baseline measure of ranking mortgages and defining expensive choices, they leave a lot of money on the table relative to a baseline in their choice set. Firstly, what do these look like through time? A cross bank is across all 6 banks. The menu, I've pasted all banks' menus on top of each other. And the within bank is where I compare you only to other options that you could have chosen within the bank that you shopped at. And here I'm taking the percentage of people that make these expensive choices through time each month. What you can see is these numbers aren't enormous. Red lines and blue lines, 7% is the red line, 2.3% is the blue line. But there's quite a lot of time variation through our sample. So expensive choices exist, and there's variation through time. The project started thinking about expensive choices as people just making expensive choices. They're picking badly. But we pretty quickly realized that there are 2 ways to an expensive choice. One of which is, how well did you pick? You had 100 choices. Did you get choice number 1, or did you get choice number 2? But there's also the stakes that were at play in your choice set. If you had no price dispersion in your menu, you couldn't possibly make an expensive choice. You can't leave money on the table because there was no choice that enabled you to do that. If you were presented with a menu that had extreme price dispersion, then even making an all-rightish choice would lead you to leave a lot of money on the table. We pretty quickly realized we had to think quite hard about that second. So to get at that, we are defining this variable bad payer, which is look in your menu and compute what percentage of the mortgages in your menu, if you had chosen them, would have represented an expensive choice. We'll call that the bad tail. It's a function of price dispersion. If there's no price dispersion, this must be zero. If there's large price dispersion, then this number goes up. It's price dispersion in the tail. This is this measure of price dispersion through time on the x-axis and across people in the different colors. What you can see is, again, there are these people. The median person does not have many options in their menu that would represent expensive choices, even if they pick them. But there is, again, variation through time, and the fact that the blue line is quite high says that some people face menus filled with bad choices. And the shape of this through time might look familiar. So what we do is we plot the mean of this bad tail and a scatter against the mean probability of making an expensive choice in a month, i.e. this graph against this graph, and we get this. Bad tail in the month on the x-axis, probability or the frequency of an expensive choice in the y-axis. We see is an extremely striking positive correlation, where the R-squared is super high, 95%. What this says is that we wanted to learn about people leaving money on the table. That is extremely, in the time series, driven by the extent to which they were given menus that enabled them to potentially leave money on the table. To learn about expensive choices, you really need to understand this price dispersion. You really need to understand the price dispersion in the menu that is set towards people. To learn why people make expensive choices, we need to understand menu quality. I'll briefly refer to some other things in the paper that we do. I'm not going to show you here. Menu quality is what matters. If you tell me how price dispersed a certain group's menu was, how much price dispersion there was, that is the key driver of whether that group is more or less likely to leave money on the table. Conditional on that, some other things do matter. The thing that matters most is the initial rate during the 2, 3, 5 year period. That's the key thing to get right. The fee doesn't make a difference really, and the reset rate doesn't make a massive difference either. And there is a role for picking well at your bank, in the menu at the bank you shopped at. Part of people leaving money on the table is just picking poorly from that menu. But there's a bigger role for going to the right bank. So you might pick okay at your bank, you've just gone to a bank where a lot of the mortgages of your type were expensive. But we're now going to go on to talking about what menu quality, what determines that and how that varies across people. I just want to, how much time do I have, Alan, just to check? I can't hear you, but I think it's about 5 or 10 minutes, something like that.
5 to 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So who gets a bad menu? So just to emphasize, the UK mortgage market it's not really like the US. It's kind of like a supermarket. There's not much individual negotiation. And if I qualify for a mortgage, someone with my characteristics who's not me also qualifies for the same mortgage. And by law, they're not allowed to zoom in and say, you with your certain characteristic get this mortgage, and you, according to some other protected characteristic, maybe gender, maybe race, you get a different mortgage menu. They can't tailor the menu perfectly on certain protected characteristics, and nor obviously can they do it based on certain hidden characteristics. Like if they sat me down to do an IQ test, they might want to tailor the mortgage menu that they offer based on that, but they're not allowed to and they're unable to do. So there's only certain things that they can tailor the extent of the price dispersion, the extent of this bad tail on. They are largely LTV and LTI. The loan value as a fraction of your income, and the loan value as the fraction of as a ratio of your income, sorry, and the loan value as a fraction of the value of your house. What we've plotted here is people into buckets of low LTI and low LTV on the left-hand side, and high LTI, high LTV on the right-hand side. So people on the right-hand side, leveraged and are borrowing a lot relative to their income. People on the left-hand side, not very leveraged and not borrowing a lot relative to their income. You can see is that half the sample, roughly, these low LTI, low LTV people, they get low stakes mortgage menus. No price dispersion, hardly any price dispersion. As you increase LTV or LTI into one of the higher buckets, or even more so when you're one of this 5% of people that are high LTI and high LTV, price dispersion blows up for you. So banks offer worse menus to high LTV and high LTI customers. So I've shown that the key driver of making expensive choices is, were you given the ability to make expensive choices? And I've shown you that the people who get given the ability to make expensive choices, given high stakes mortgage menus, are high LTV and high LTI customers. Who takes out these mortgages? Well, what I've done here is I've regressed whether someone took out a high LTV, first column, a high LTI mortgage, second column, or a high LTV and high LTI mortgage, third column, on various demographics, whether you were under 30 or over 45, whether you were a first-time buyer, whether you're in the bottom or top tertile of the income distribution. What you can see here is that the positive numbers are young people and people with less experience of this choice. They are the ones that take out high LTV and high LTI mortgages, and hence they're the ones that are going to be given these high stakes mortgage contracts. Then we can say, based on those things, you know what the answer is going to be to this, but who ends up leaving lots of money on the table? Well, here I'm plotting whether you make an expensive choice, as I defined earlier, on these demographics. In the first column, unconditionally, just including product dummies, that's 2, 3, or 5-year fixed. What you can see is that young people are more likely to make these expensive choices that leave a lot of money on the table. So are first-time buyers, and there's a small role for poor people being more likely to make those. Once we control for our measure of the price dispersion in the menu that they get, those effects become much, much smaller. The young people and first-time buyers are more likely to make expensive choices, and that is by and large driven by the fact that they are given menus with high price dispersion that mean that when they don't pick well, they do leave a lot of money on the table. So the last thing is to take these results and try and understand what might drive them. The thought is risk. That's the first thing you're worrying about here. LTV, LTI, risk is likely to correlate with these things. Could that drive our results? We don't think so. Firstly, default in our sample in the UK is extremely rare. Mortgages are with full recourse. Secondly, the default patterns, if you plot default in the pattern in the data, according to people's LTV and LTI, it doesn't look the same as that pattern of price dispersion in the menu that I offered. But thirdly, whilst it might be the case that risk may cause the average price to vary by people's leverage, not so clear-cut that it should cause price dispersion in the menus that these different people get to vary according to leverage. So sure, high LTV borrowers might be more risky than low LTV borrowers, and hence the average menu, all their menu offerings will be more expensive. But we're giving a story about price dispersion. And given the first 2 points here, and given the structure of the UK mortgage market, the institutional detail, we don't think risk can explain. Approval standards, could it be that maybe these people, we say they made a bad choice, but actually they just didn't qualify for mortgage that we said they should have picked? Well, like I said, I showed you results across banks, but all these same results hold within the lender at which you shop. And within the lender at which you shopped, we know by virtue of the UK institutional setup pretty clearly which products you could have qualified for. And so we're pretty confident as to what your choice set was. And approval standards aren't going to vary across the products that we assign you in your menu there. So we don't think approval standards can possibly explain these results. Refinancing, that 7-year window over which we computed the NPV, that might sound suspicious at first. It's certainly arbitrary what we chose. So we varied around with it. We assumed that people refinanced earlier, later, after their initial 2-year, 3-year, 5-year period. When we do that, results are pretty much the same. That makes sense because I told you that what matters is the initial rate. Reset rate doesn't play a big role in our results. So refinancing, or our assumption about refinancing, isn't driving our results. Only preferences. Can we rationalize these people leaving money on the table by virtue of them really not wanting to, really being happy to pay a high initial rate, or really prizing paying a 0 fee rather than £500 fee and being willing to sacrifice a lot of initial rate, a lot of expense over their mortgage lifetime because of that? And that's what I mentioned in response to Klaas's question, which was dominated choices. When we say you've only picked poorly if you pick worse on the basis of initial rates, fees, and reset rates, when we say that, and we say you only make an expensive choice if you do that, the same patterns live up. What's left, I'll finish by just saying what we think is the only explanation that can explain what we find then. And it's price discrimination by the menu. There's this model by Menzio and Tractor that set out a model that goes something like this, which are, suppose there are two types of customers. Sophisticated customers go to a bunch of banks and pick the cheapest product in a set of samples they draw from each bank. They're shoppers. They shop around and they shop within each bank as well. And there's randomizers. They walk into a random bank, they pick a random menu option on the menu. I have to offer the same mortgage menu to certain groups. There's a trade-off there. I want to get cheap options in there to entice sophisticated customers. I want expensive offers in there to profit from these randomizers. I can't tailor things perfectly, so I've got to offer menus with price dispersion to different groups. What am I going to do? Logically, I'm going to tail up, rise up, increase the price dispersion in the menu when I think that the people shopping are more likely to be of randomizers type than sophisticated types. So this is Menzio and Tractor's model in spirit. Does it explain our results? Well, young and first-time buyers, they're more likely to be constrained. They are picking out high LTV, high LPI mortgages. They couldn't afford a bigger mortgage. They may not qualify at other lenders, so they might be constrained in some sense. And there's a whole load of literature that says that people are less likely to pick well when they're less experienced, and they're less experienced in this particular choice, which is buying a house. So this seems to match our story pretty well. And given that we've ruled out all the other candidate explanations we have, we think this is the best explanation for what we have. I'll finish by concluding, which are a fact. Making a mortgage choice is difficult because mortgages are kind of fiddly, complicated objects. And there are a bunch of different mortgages, a proliferation of different mortgages on any person's menu. Most people don't pick well in an ordinal sense, but competition in some sense protects them. They don't leave a lot of money on the table. But some customers face large menus with large price dispersion. These people are young people and first-time buyers. And the only explanation that we think can survive to rationalize these results is that banks are using the menu to price discriminate. They are dialing up price dispersion for groups that they think are less able to pick well. And as a result, these people are more likely to leave money on the table. Okay, that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was excellent. So we can open it up for questions. We have about 7 minutes. So you can just ask questions directly.
I have a question that is more just a sort of different interpretation. So there's the young first-time buyers, and you say these are unsophisticated, less able to distinguish. An alternative way to looking at these first-time buyers is that just those are the rationally inattentive guys, which makes it a bit less of a negative story of the banks taking advantage. These people are just optimally, inattentive. How do you think about this?
So it's a very good point. It's a very good question. You'll notice that I like models. I try and write papers with models. There's no model in this paper. And so we can't distinguish between the following things, one of which is a really nefarious story where the bank sees a young person comes in and gets out and folds up the menu so that they can only see the expensive thing and steers them towards it, versus these people have high-powered jobs that mean that they leave money on the table because their search costs, the opportunity cost of searching hard is high. We can't rule those things out, but I think for the conclusions we're trying to draw, we're fine with either, because it's still, in some kind of first best sense, not optimal. And I don't have a mortgage, but when I take one out, I think I'll do it quite quickly, and I may leave a lot of money on the table. But if I were offered £100 extra a month in my bank account, I would like it. You may push back that the policy prescriptions might vary depending on those two different models, which I think is fair. But I think our finding that they are profiting from these people's making more expensive choices for whatever reason could be either explanation. I think that's a very good point.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think what would be interesting is to think about the transition from being an unexperienced customer to an experienced customer, because your story would predict that, right? At some point, the household will be rebalanced, refinance or switch to different banks, so in some sense, if the bank is taking advantage of the customer, this may also have negative implications down the road, right?
Absolutely. So by virtue of the sample we use for the data currently, we can't say much about that because we don't see many people coming back and again a couple of years down the line, but we took a long time to write the paper, so now we could extend that. And I think studying whether these people learn and are therefore are less prone to make these expensive choices, and banks recognize that and don't screw them over, don't take advantage of that. I think that's super interesting, and I would love to do that.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Giovanna.
So, hi, Jimmy. I was wondering whether considering tax deductions may change the relative convenience of the relative cost of the menus. I don't know which is the institutional setup in England, whether just interest rates are deductible, but
nothing is deductible.
Nothing? Nothing is deductible?
Yeah.
Okay, so the answer is
Is that right, Jamie?
I believe so. So there are things that are designed to help young people take out mortgages and stuff, but that would be a kind of intercept shift for all the menus in our mortgage. And so within our menu, I don't think there's anything that can rationalize these expensive choices based on some tax treatment of rates or fees or something like that. Any government subsidy applies to all our things. I understand that's different.
It's different from the US, so there's nothing is tax deductible. Yeah, and I think that's the right thing to do. Like when people, like I think we shouldn't fiddle around with taxes to induce certain aspects. So I think you buy a house, it's a private decision, you pay the cost. The taxpayer shouldn't bear the cost. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yes, no, I mean, I agree with that. I'm just thinking, yeah. So there are policy responses to this. I'm sure. So basically, one way people make expensive choices is by fixating on not paying a high fee, which just seems like madness because the fees are small. Low fee products generally come with high initial rates, and so that leads them to focus on this thing that they could just add on to the mortgage, and then they end up losing a lot of money. So you could fiddle around with taxes to try and disincentivize people doing that. You could ban these initial fees. And if you really took our story literally, I think you would want to do that. And I think that might be a good idea. There are two ways of viewing these types of settings, some of which is people care about fees differentially to rates. And so they are making rational decisions to leave money on the table. I don't think that's true. I think these people are leaving money on the table. So if you fiddle around with tax deductibility to stop people making these types of errors, I think that would help. Or you could ban some of these extraneous features of mortgages that lead people to make expensive choices. Anything in that direction, I think, according to our story, would make things better.
Like, as a policy measure, would it be good that every mortgage has one number attached to it, which tells the buyer how much they are leaving, how costly the mortgage is?
I think that would be very good. And so there are websites that do something like that. I think in our sample, they were less used than they are now, and even those are imperfect. But if there were a law that said just before you take out the mortgage, something was flashed up saying that according to this measure, there's also this here. If people still make the expensive choice, then fair enough. But I think something like that would surely get rid of a lot of this.
So I think we are out of time. Giovanna, you want to go ahead?
Maybe I'll ask directly Jamie. It was a clarification.
Thank you very much. So next month on the 14th is our next CAFFE seminar. So I look forward to seeing all of you then. And thank you for joining us today. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Jamie, are you there?
Yes, I held on.
Just 1 second. I was just wondering whether there are some menus which are offered online and whether that reduces the incidence of mistakes. And that would also maybe scale down the possibility of inattention, optimal inattention.
So let me just check I understand. So there are these websites that they print menus online, they aggregate different menus across different people, and they do this kind of ranking. And to the extent that they've become more popular since then, and to the extent that people use them and they rank things in the right way or the same way as us, they should reduce the instance of these mistakes. So the only way that our results can be explained with the coexistence of that is people don't use that, or they don't understand it, or they look at that
in your sample, you don't have a variability in the way that menus are presented.
No. So we know what you could have picked, but we don't really know.
Okay.
We don't know the salience of what you were shown. So you could have gone into a bank.
I see.
You could have seen 5, and there could have been another 5 online, and we know for sure you could have picked either of those 10. But we don't really know which one you were shown or whether you were steered to one versus the other. All we know is you left money on the table. And presumably that means that either you were shown the full menu and messed up, or somehow you were shown the subset. We don't know what to do with this.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you. I very much enjoyed your talk. Hope to see you around.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Jamila.
Thank you, Jamila. Bye.
Bye.